Every day, we rise, challenging ourselves to work for what we believe in. At U.S. Border Patrol, protecting our borders is more than a job. It's a calling. Agents answer the call, working together to keep our country and communities safe. If you are ready for a new mission, join U.S. Border Patrol and go beyond. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders, from ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities. CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. It is a Thursday, folks. It is July the 28th, year of our Lord, 2022. Just keeps rolling right along, and we got to roll right along with it. But we're going to keep trying to turn down the noise of the news cycle, talk about some important things today. We're going to do a double dose, a little different program, double dose of overseas foreign policy things going on in the world. First, our buddy Roy Mathews, a Young Voices contributor. Usually we have him on for domestic policy. He's got a piece out in International Policy Digest talking about Kazakhstan, an important country. Why? Because like some other countries we've been covering, there's a lot of cross streams going on. They border China. They've been under the thumb of first the Soviet Union and now Russia for a very long time. And its leader has stood up to Vladimir Putin, at least publicly. Is that a show? Is that for real? What about their oil reserves? There's also American oil companies involved. A lot of moving parts of an important crossroads between Asia and Europe. We'll get into that with Roy Mathews, talk a little Kazakhstan. A little closer to home, about 90 minutes off the coast, by the way. Cuba is in trouble, or if you're JFK, Cuba. There's a lot of trouble going on down there. There's been a lot of protests. There's been a crackdown, a lot of draconian measures to put people back in line, but it's not solving the problems. Food shortages, fuel shortages, and now, on top of everything else they got going on, the healthcare system is not doing well, despite what some of our communist friends in the media keep wanting to tell you. Cassanra, another Young Voices contributor, is going to join us. We're going to talk about Cuba, what's going on down there, what's part of it is the embargo, what's new, what's old, what's ongoing issues. A lot of stuff to unpack at Cuba, something that's just off our coast that we don't pay enough attention to, haven't paid enough attention to it for a long time, getting really ugly for our friends in Cuba. I'm going to talk about that on the program today. Let's start domestically, though, something a little closer to home. You know, we like these stories where you have something that's, you know, common knowledge or just everybody assumes it's true, and then it turns out it's not true. And we like to cover stories like that because we're always refining the information rotation we have. You got to challenge your own thinking and presuppositions and your priors. Make sure you know what you're talking about. There's been this thing going around for a long time that the millennials were just lazy and didn't want to work. Well, the Washington Post has a very interesting piece out that that's not entirely the case. I'm going to join this piece about halfway through, about 40 minutes to Allen's north in Allen, Texas. Jason Cabrera, 20, knows the teen workforce inside and out. Inside because until his most recent birthday, he was a teen. And out because he's been a general manager at Lane's Chicken Fingers since he was 19, hiring and managing a largely teen workforce, first at the store in Allen and now in nearby Louisville. Cabrera used to see dozens of applications each week, and he could take his pick of industry veterans. These days, he's lucky if he gets a single application. These worker shortages make businesses like Lane's far more willing to accommodate the hassle inherent in hiring modern teens who spend 9 months of the year juggling school, sports, and outside activities. But once summer hits, Cabrera said, most of these kids just want to work like all former kids did, and that's all they want to do. The Zoomers were consistent. It wasn't teens who changed. It was the businesses. So we got on the phone again. Lynn James, owner of Flowers and Cappuccino. Sorry, that's a weird combination. by Lasting Visions, a bright spot of floral arrangements and fancy coffees in Bowman, a rural hubbub of 1,470 on North Dakota's rolling western plains. She's also the mayor, by the way. Gotta love small towns. In the past, Washington Post says, James said she struggled to find teen workers. It's impossible to build a regular schedule around their myriad obligations at school, the community, and their homes and ranches. But with workers in short supply, teen hiring became a necessity, so James embraced the flexibility. She began drawing up schedules that could accommodate teen activities and hire a mix of young folks involved in different sports and clubs who don't all need to be off at the same times. We still have good coverage and staffing, and yet the kids can still be kids, James said. Other businesses told a similar story. Around the time Zoomers started returning to the workforce, the competition for workers heated up, and folks who mastered the teen hiring had significant advantages. For example, when Chad Smith and his wife Carol started Sugar Peach, I think I'm saying this right, I'm trying, Sugar Peach, a decade ago, serving soul food, fried fish, fried chicken, and sides, in the fast-growing Iowa City suburb of North Liberty, they didn't need teenagers. It was easy to find people with experience at the price point that we had at the time we're needing the place, Simmons said. We could always pay it around the minimum wage and still find people. If they do their college right, that's work for free, but that's neither here nor there. But as the economy improved, older workers were drawn to higher paying work at manufacturers and distributors. So Simmons got creative. Drawing on a skill honed in his previous career as a human resource professional, he launched Scholars Making Dollars, a program to train and mentor high school freshmen. And in just a few years, the high school scholars program that had matured into a pillar of his business model. We started putting a development component in there, trying to make sure they're all set up to do well in high school and then go on to college. Payroll data, listen to this number, from more than 200,000 businesses using Gusto showed a similar trend nationwide. In April 2019, teens made up about 2% of new hires on their platforms, Gusto's Pardue. By this April, the teen share of new hires had more than quadrupled to 9%. Wages grew faster for teens than for any other group. What we're seeing across all industries, Pardue said, really is that teens are stepping up to fill this gap as older workers age out of the workforce or are either still unable or unwilling to come back. So if school and extracurriculars don't actually keep teens from working, and as long as businesses are willing to hire them, maybe this isn't a supply problem at all. Maybe millennials' notorious generation-defining exit from the teen labor force was always about demand. When demand for workers change, teens feel it first. They're more exposed to the cruelties of the economic cycle than any other group. And millennials have had worse economic luck than any generation in history. I disagree strongly with that. That's lazy reporting, but we'll come back to that some other time. Millennials entering the workforce amid two significant recessions and the jobless recoveries that followed, meaning that they were always pitted against legions of laid-off, more experienced workers, said Northeastern University economist Alicia Sanzer-Modestino. Millennial teens also face stiff competition from another huge reservoir of talented, hardworking adult competitors, a Mathematica senior researcher who tracks youth and employment trends. The immigration population soared through the millennial era, with the foreign-born share of the population peaking at 2018 at its highest level since 1850. It's declined since, partly due to immigration policies of the Trump era and restrictions related to the coronavirus pandemic. But meanwhile, many of the entry-level jobs that drew Gen X into the workforce began evaporating as millennials hit the job market. Low-wage teen workers at video rental stores were replaced by the high-wage adult programmers at the few video streaming giants. Paper carriers simply phased out over time. Highly skilled adults who made newspapers available online delivered by internet protocols rather than by bicycles. It's a changing world out there. It was easy for everybody to say, well, millennials were lazy and didn't want to work. But if there wasn't any jobs for them, maybe it was an unfair stereotype. We should always go back and revisit things that we assumed was true, especially now because there's certain cohorts that still think millennials are the young kids. They're not. They're in their 30s, early 40s. They've got families of their own. They're working. They're in the workforce. Get rid and update your stereotypes, please. And maybe, just maybe, we didn't have it right to start with if you just thought it was a lazy generation. Maybe there were some extenuating circumstances that they had to adapt and overcome. Plus, if you don't update your stereotypes and you don't get an accurate picture, how are you going to judge them going forward when we start talking about culture and politics for what's going to be the dominant cohort for the next 20, 30 years? More Heard Tell right after this.
Every day, we rise, challenging ourselves to work for what we believe in. At U.S. Border Patrol, protecting our borders is more than a job. It's a calling. Agents answer the call, working together to keep our country and communities safe. If you're ready for a new mission, join U.S. Border Patrol and go beyond. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders, from ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities. CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
Welcome to Heard Tell. We are back with our boy Roy. That's not me saying that. That's actually his Twitter handle because he's just funny like that. Roy Mathews is back on the program. Been a minute since we talked to him. He does public policy for the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure, but we're going to talk a little foreign policy today. Roy, how you been, my friend?
I've been pretty good. How about yourself?
Thrilled to see you again. Okay. I love foreign policy. We're kind of in an isolationist phase in America. Let's just be honest. America's not really paying attention overseas unless it was Afghanistan. They've kind of paid attention to Ukraine a little better, I think, than some other things, but that's kind of waning. So why in the world do we need to pay attention to Kazakhstan all of a sudden?
Well, most Americans don't know anything about Kazakhstan except for the Sacha Baron Cohen character, Borat. But Kazakhstan is actually a pretty important country, both geostrategically and for energy resources. Kazakhstan exports, I think 80% of their exports are oil and natural gas. A lot of it used to go through Russia, but in recent time, there has been a lot of instability within the Kazakh regime. And the new president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, has actually thumbed his nose publicly at the Russians. And in doing so has encountered some difficulty with exporting that oil and gas to Europe. So there is a good opportunity here for the U.S. or other Western countries to both peel away what has been a very historically Russian ally and also counteract Chinese investment for their Belt and Road initiatives. That is a proposal to flood markets with Chinese products and allow the Chinese government to buy up strips of land and portions of geostrategic areas that they feel would benefit their military.
Now, so let's back up and make sure, because people probably aren't real familiar with it. So let's just make sure everybody's on the same page. This is, of course, they were dominated by the Soviets like everybody else in that region for many, many decades. Their relationship has been pretty Moscow-centric over the last little bit. But then we had this meeting. He actually, you're not overstating it. This is in public. This was at a meeting in Europe. And he told him, he's like, we're not going to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk, the breakaway regions in Ukraine that Russia is finagling and frankly lying about to try to make them their own country so they can annex them, take them over, dominate them. This was a really big deal. And it didn't seem to get a lot of press, especially in Western media.
That's right. It's a pretty unprecedented for a Kazakh president or Kazakh leader to go on stage with a Russian president and tell him to his face that we are not going to recognize the breakaway so-called republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, and also that they were not going to provide any military aid to the Ukraine war. And that has set off a lot of alarm bells within the Russian regime. Russian state media has been going on these tirades and threatening Kazakhstan over their lack of support. And there have been several instances of Russian courts and the Russian government taking retaliatory measures towards the Kazakh government for Tokayev's what they call ingratitude.
Yeah. So give us a little background on this guy, because there's some debate even within his own country of his legitimacy. Of course, Russia's all kinds of, well, you're not legitimate because now he's not playing ball with them. So take that for what that's worth. But even in his own country, this isn't a super stable guy. Is this politically calculated that he's going after Putin? Is this a matter of principle for him? Is it somewhere in the middle? Just give us some background on this guy.
It's a little bit in the middle. And, a big objection to the sort of deification of Volodymyr Zelensky is that Ukraine is a very corrupt country, and we don't really know sort of what his deal is. And it's sort of the same situation for Kazakhstan. Tokayev was the dictator Nazarbayev's longtime deputy. Nazarbayev ruled Kazakhstan from its founding in the 1990s up until just recently in 2020. So he is very, very close to the old dictatorship. But he has recognized that because Russia intervened into Kazakhstan and kept him as president, this was back in earlier this year. There were a couple of anti-government protests over fuel price increases, and that led to rioting, and a lot of people were killed, and the Russian regime had to send in special forces to help quell the rioting. And so a lot of the ordinary Kazakh people see Tokayev as just another Russian puppet who wasn't really elected, even though there was a snap election right after all this chaos died down. And so Tokayev, for him, he wants to appear legitimate because he wants to stay in power. And in order to do that, he kind of has to thumb his nose at at his patron, Russia. And in doing so, it's opened up a couple of opportunities for China, which Kazakhstan shares an eastern border with, to sort of fill that investment gap, fulfill what Russia is not doing, not facilitating Kazakh exports, not investing in infrastructure and other sorts of projects.
Now, let's be adults here, because we understand this is a different cultural region. Like you said, he has deep ties to the old regime, so he knows how the sausage is made. He knows the game. So we know Lukashenko, and we know how he is. He's seen as a puppet, but he will also occasionally thumb his nose at Putin for the good. Erdogan in Turkey, he plays both sides against the middle. While he just publicly kind of made Putin look bad a couple weeks ago, and then you find out this week he's facilitating the Iran stuff under the table to help Putin out.
Yep.
Is it what it appears to be? Because in this region with these players, that's a fair question to always ask, is what we're seeing when you see something that public to Vladimir Putin, is that something Putin's maybe playing along with? Because this is somebody he propped up with. Is that a concern?
It is a concern. However, the actions taken by the Russian state show that Tokayev really is acting out of his own self-interest here. There was a court order from a Russian federal court that halted oil exports through the Caspian Oil Consortium, which is this oil company in Kazakhstan that exports 80% of Kazakh oil, which is a massive amount of resources. And what this court did was issued an injunction to halt all exports for 30 days out of some quote unquote corruption allegations. This obviously frightened Tokayev, because he doesn't want to be known as the guy who just took that lying down and led to the Kazakh economy shrinking. So he has actually directed the Kazakh state oil company, Kazmunai Gas, to start looking for alternate routes to other markets besides Russia for Kazakh gas. And it's already starting to happen. Tokayev also announced that he is going to prioritize shipping more oil to Europe, since obviously the Kazakh oil needs a market, and Russia is a direct competitor and is also under heavy sanctions that are targeting oil and gas. So Tokayev really is trying to shore up his own legitimacy. And I think the fact that the Russians are directly targeting the Kazakh economy and Tokayev is responding is that these actions are Tokayev's actions alone.
Okay, so China makes this interesting, talking to our buddy Roy back on Heard Tell again. China makes this interesting for a couple reasons, because they and Xi and Putin are allies right now, but they're not natural allies. They're going to bump heads again somewhere down the road. China is showing some interest here. This is just another case, along with some others, where I don't think they would mind expanding business in Kazakhstan like they have some other places, even if it needles the Russians a little bit, because one is, this is how they expand their power. They do it financially. And two is, you explain for people that don't have a map in front of them geographically, if you're going to do a Belt and Road Initiative and you're going to link Asia and Europe, this is one of those places you just physically have to go to, right?
Yes, absolutely. Kazakhstan sits on one of the ancient old Silk Road pathways, and in order for Chinese products and Chinese investment to have a literal roadway to Europe, you're going to need to develop Kazakh infrastructure and transportation routes. So what the Chinese have done is they've sort of looked at Russian meddling in Kazakhstan and said, well, all right, this plays to our advantage, because at least the Kazakh elites are looking for investments, looking for partnerships, because everyone likes some Chinese money nowadays. So what the Chinese have done is they have over 700 joint ventures between Kazakh and Chinese companies as of now. And China has become Kazakhstan's largest trading partner and the biggest source of foreign direct investment. But this also doesn't really sit well with the Kazakh people because most of Kazakhstan are ethnic Kazakhs, along with some Uyghurs and other sort of Turkic steppe people, which are the same people that the Chinese have been imprisoning in the western province of Xinjiang. Excuse my pronunciation of that, which does not sit well with the Kazakh people at all.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, the Uyghurs, how this all goes together. There's some cultural stuff going on underneath this because politics and culture, doesn't matter what culture and politics you're talking about, they're going to go together. Talking to our buddy Roy Mathews. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. More on Kazakhstan. A lot of cross streams here, Russia, China, and you guessed it, there's even American oil companies involved because, of course, there is. More with Roy Mathews right after this.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Roy Mathews is back with us on the program, talking a little foreign policy today. Kazakhstan, we love going overseas, getting a broad perspective. Here's another one of those countries. You know, Crossroads is not putting it too fine a point on it, is it, Roy? Because we have China, we have Russia. Obviously, you have the surrounding countries. None of them are particularly stable. And the biggest private exporter of oil is Chevron. That's an American company last time I checked. What's the stability factor here for this, especially if they start doing things with the gas, oil? We know how those things go. Talk about the stability of the country, especially if they start trying to switch from Russia to China and then maybe back again when it's advantageous to the regime.
Certainly. So the Kazakh elites are very much interested in more Chinese investment. They understand that it's ultimately going to hit their bottom line if Tokayev decides to anger the Russians, and the Russians can shut off pipeline routes through Russia that take their oil to market. However, the ordinary Kazakhs have demonstrated, protested, and even rioted over additional Chinese projects in their country. There were protests, obviously, over the 2018 whistleblower that used to teach in the Uyghur concentration camps in China. This was a teacher who was an ethnic Kazakh who came to the press and who really sort of exposed the sterilization, the torture, and the cultural genocide that's happening in these Chinese concentration camps. And ordinary Kazakhs have protested against a scheme by the Kazakh government to allow Chinese investors and sometimes Chinese citizens to buy up large swaths of arable land in Kazakhstan, which is a huge issue because Kazakhstan sits on a steppe. It's very dry, it's very arid, and it has a very cold winter. And so the Kazakh people worry about their own ability to provide food for themselves, whereas if the Chinese were to buy it, they're scared that the food will just be shipped to China.
Yeah, and it's not just they have the largest diaspora of the Uyghurs coming out of China, both refugees and just naturally, because this is a mix of, like you said, Turkish steppe type peoples. There's a lot of different ethnic groups, even inside the ethnic groups here. A bigger picture a little bit, because you have these. Look, these folks aren't dumb. They see what's going on in Sri Lanka. They see what's going on in other parts of the world with China. It's not just culturally, is it? They're worried about self-identity and national sovereignty when it comes to taking this Chinese money, because everybody got a cell phone, even in Kazakhstan now, and they're seeing like, wait a minute, it comes with stuff on the back ends if we don't make good on our part of it.
No, absolutely. You couldn't have said it better. And it's good that you brought up Sri Lanka, because that's one of the biggest examples of the Chinese using debt traps to seize control of strategic as well as economically beneficial ports. There is a port in Sri Lanka that was built completely with Chinese money, Chinese construction workers, Chinese materials. And when the Sri Lankans could not pay for it, the Chinese just seized it. Now they have control of both a military base and a port. So the Kazakhs sort of look at another example of factory relocations. The Chinese have attempted to relocate a lot of their heavy manufacturing, agricultural, and industrial factories away from China and into Kazakhstan. And most of the Kazakhs don't want that, because they see those bringing in a lot of Chinese workers. And what people need to understand is when China goes and invests in these places, they're not necessarily hiring the local population. The Kazakhs can sort of make up support industries or have very limited roles in economies surrounding these large complexes, but it's mainly Han Chinese workers, and and those cultures do clash. There is a lot of historical animosity there, and it makes a lot of the ordinary Kazakhs very, very nervous about different Chinese investment schemes in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, Roy Mathews joining us. Okay. All of that said, all that history, all that culture, all that politics we just went through, you argue in your piece, International Politics Digest, that if we had a coherent foreign policy, there would be an opening here for America, or maybe the broader West, maybe Europe, to get a foothold of support here. Run us down the list. Pitch it to us like you were selling it to the EU. Why should they, or America, why should they step in here and try to fill the power vacuum away from Putin and make Kazakhstan more of an ally?
Well, first off, I'd keep going back to oil and gas. You mentioned Chevron and American oil companies. Chevron and other American oil companies have been involved in Kazakhstan since its independence in the 1990s. They know that there's massive oil and gas deposits in the country, and they've reaped enormous profit from building facilities, building refineries, and facilitating the transport of those resources. The U.S. has an opportunity here to make some money and promote U.S. investment instead of the alternative, which is Chinese and Russian investment, and also help supply Europe, which is now being subject to Russian geostrategic pressure via their own gas deposits, as a way for Europe to get a good source of energy without having to go through Russia. So we already have a good strategic foothold through Chevron, through all these oil and gas companies. But the Kazakh leadership needs to know that there's some other party out there that would be willing to invest and develop this economy. And in terms of Chinese investment, with a lot of strings attached and a cultural genocide happening that will not mesh well with the local populace, and Russia, which is actively attacking their economy right now, U.S. investment looks very, very appealing for Kazakhstan. But the biggest barrier to that is, I have a good quote from one of the articles I cited, is we don't really pay attention to Central Asia. One of these articles that I cited, this is an entrepreneur in Kazakhstan who was looking for Chinese investment for a wind energy project. And he says, quote, "We traveled to the United States a few times, but when the first question was, quote, where is Kazakhstan? You understand they're not going to give you the money," end quote. And that's from a piece that I cited in my essay. So it's very much just a lack of awareness, a lack of what Kazakhstan could do for us. That's really holding the U.S. response back.
Yeah, I think we get a little obsessed with more of the superpowers dealing with China, dealing with Russia. Not that we shouldn't. There's a lot of other things going on in the world. You can start clobbering 3 or 4 or 5 of those countries together, and you start getting kind of close. It's just we're just in that period where our country just isn't paying attention overseas. It's going to bite us in the butt one of these days, I'm sure. Roy Mathews, this is great stuff. I hope people learned a little bit more about this region. If nothing else, maybe they'll know that they need to pay attention to this going forward when the headlines pop up, either overseas media. Let folks know where they can follow you until we get you back again, my friend. What you normally do, because you don't always do foreign policy, you're usually off on other things. Let folks know where they can follow you and what you got going on, my friend.
Sure. You could follow me on Twitter at yaboy_Roy98, and with a Y in yaboy. And you can also find me on LinkedIn and through the Young Voices talent page if you want to see any other articles or media appearances that I've made.
Yeah, you do good work, my friend. It's great talking to you again. Let's do it again real soon. Let us know when you got something coming out, and we'll be happy to hash it out here on Heard Tell.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, been a minute since she's been here, but she's been here a couple times before. Thrilled to reconnect. She was busy getting yet another advanced degree because she's just that sort of smart. Good friend of ours, Young Voices contributor. Cassanra Shawn's back on the program. Welcome back. Been a while.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be back.
She just finished up yet another master's degree at the University of Chicago in public policy. She also went to a little school called Cambridge, you might have heard of. I guess if you have to go to school overseas, that's not too shabby. And went to some place called UCLA. Really sharp young lady. We always enjoyed talking to her. Let's talk something kind of semi-domestic because it's only 90 miles off the coast, but it's been a thorn in the side of the U.S. policy, and it's been a rough road for its people for many, many years. Cuba hasn't been getting as much press in the U.S. as it normally would. There's been other issues going on, but things are getting kind of ugly down there, aren't they?
Yeah, I've heard some people discuss it as kind of like the worst humanitarian crisis Cuba's faced in the past 100 years. So definitely something to be concerned about here in the U.S., I think.
Now that's saying something if that is accurate, considering everything that's gone on there over the last 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with this because I want to start big picture before we get into the current economic crisis and the healthcare crisis and the fuel crisis. Some of that's universal to other parts of the world. Some of it is unique to Cuba because of the situation they're in. I want to start big picture though, because our socialist democratic friends love to talk about Cuba, and they will blow off any problems that Cuba's having. Is like, well, of course they're having problems. There's an embargo. Now, we know the embargo isn't what it used to be. There's semi-relations. It's formal. It's informal. It changes. In fact, we're going to talk in a minute. Breaking news just a couple of days ago, the Cuban government on financial reforms letting U.S. money back into the country. We'll talk about that in a minute. Turn down the noise on that, though, because, of course, the embargo has an economic effect. That's why it's there. What's the status of that? What's noise? What is the embargo? What is the bad policy of the government? Where's the ratio on that so we can kind of get to the truth of what's actually going on there before you get to the specific issues?
Yeah, I mean, Cuba has an embargo, or we have an embargo currently in place against Cuba. There definitely is a lot of noise around kind of like how exactly is the U.S. kind of sticking its thumb on Cuba for no reason. That's the first thing. And secondly, what is the U.S.'s fault? What is Cuba's fault? What Cuban government's fault, right? I think there's an interesting stat. I think Russia has loaned, I think 2 years ago, they loaned Cuba over $1 billion to improve its infrastructure, and Cuba, the money is gone. That's vanished. Cuba, they are also suffering, I mean, deeply from the diesel and with the fuel price crisis right now. Part of that is Russia, kind of, but they get most of their oil from Venezuela. So not really. Venezuela has their own, they're having their own issues over there. So they're kind of trickling back to Cuba. But yeah, I think that a lot of the issues we're seeing in Cuba is a kind of symptom of the communist government the Cubans are facing, and less so much the U.S. embargo.
One great example that you just mentioned, Russia has been sending an infrastructure investment, a total of about 2.3 billion worth since 2006 until 2019 when they stopped doing this. And back in, let's see, what's this dated? I had to edit that, but that's okay. Back earlier this year in February, Russia actually suspended their debt payments, said, well, we're warming relations. We'll just don't worry about paying us back for this. But that was supposed to go, and I'm quoting Reuters here, that money was supposed to go to, quote, investments in power generation, metals, transportation infrastructure. Well, one of the major problems right now, and we have all kinds of reporting that started all these protests a few weeks ago, is there is major power outages. They can't keep the power on. It's an overly hot summer there. Of course, it's a Caribbean nation, so, you know, the heat, it's hot. So there's power outages and things. So when something like, you know, the Cuban people aren't dumb, they know all this investment money came in, but they can't keep the lights on. There's no wonder there's protests in the country, is there?
Oh, no, absolutely not. Also, like, it's dengue is pretty rampant, and the hospital system and like Cuba's kind of like anti-mosquito measures, they've been kind of lax lately. So there's like a health crisis, like people are suffering and sick at home. They don't have any fuel, so people are waiting up 2 weeks in line for diesel. So like taxi drivers, that's their entire income. Suddenly their entire life is spent sitting in a gas line. There's food shortages. It's a sign of the times, and the Cuban government has to imprison protesters for 6 to 30 years for taking the streets and banging pots and pans. It's very sad.
Now, here's what happened with this. They went to the streets and protested a couple weeks ago, but there was a massive crackdown. And the claims of at least 701 Cubans remain in detention from this crackdown. 622 were sentenced up to 25 years in prison. Draconian doesn't even start to touch this. The charges they leveled is the usual stuff when you want to round up the usual suspects: sedition, sabotage, robbery with force, public disorder. They cracked down on it, but are they going to see more and more of this because the fuel crisis isn't lessening? The healthcare crisis, much vaunted. We talked about some of our socialist friends. They talk about free healthcare. Well, the problem is there's nobody to blame but the government if the healthcare ain't working right. If we see more and more protests in Cuba, is it just going to get more and more draconian? Because I don't think the government's in danger of falling anytime soon. What do we make of the protests?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. I do believe it'll get more draconian, and I think the Cubans kind of have one of two options: protest and risk like massive draconian imprisonment, or they leave Cuba, which is why we've seen a massive influx of migration from Cuba in the past few years. So there's human rights. Some human rights observers, they're noting kind of some of the treatment of the prisoners in the prisons, torture. Again, these absurd prison sentences. It's not an easy time for any Cuban living under the government oppression.
No, it's definitely not. Now, of course, migration from Cuba to the U.S. is not a new thing. We have a long history and varied issues with this. But this new batch seems to be a little bit different. They're leaving en masse again. It's not the usual trickle that's been going. What do we do? Because we've already got a huge debate about immigration and migration policy. Cuban refugees have kind of had a carve out over time, especially in the Florida, and we know about the Cuban expat community down there. Is it time to revisit our policy with Cuban refugees? Should we be doing more to encourage or discourage these migrations as they try to flee Cuba with all the draconian things and all the problems they're having down there?
Just from like a human standpoint, I feel terrible for those living in Cuba and starving, no power, lack of medical services. I do think that, Florida has a very close tie with Cuba. I think that we do need to reform our immigration kind of stance on refugees in general. But Cuban in particular, I think there's a very close cultural tie there. But also I think there's something to be said about trying to encourage positive growth in Cuba as much as humanly possible. Russia has proven that sending money doesn't necessarily work for improving the situation in Cuba. But I think I am the same as many other political leaders, where it's kind of like, well, we have crisis again with Cuba, and
it's sad that we have to review it that way of like, well, it's a crisis again, but the government hasn't changed. The reason the protests are so draconian is because the machinery to crack down on that, from Castro to Castro's brother to the current leadership, that it's almost ingrained in the society. We talked about the political and the economic. What's the human rights part of this when you have a government that oppression is just ingrained into it? It's institutionalized is probably the best way to explain it. Talk about for a minute, because you study other parts of the world, especially somewhere like Cuba. It is an island. It is isolated in some respects. When you have institutional oppression like this, how much that changes the dynamic for things like human rights and civil rights?
I don't think it necessarily changes the dynamic. I think we kind of suffer in the West from a lack of kind of information coming out of Cuba. We citizens, we barely hear kind of what's happening over there. I think that's the first thing. And I think that once we kind of get more media spotlight around what's happening in Cuba, we'll be able to kind of determine this with much more accuracy. We've seen communist regimes fall before. We've seen them stay in power. I think with Cuba, I think the protests definitely come to show it, that people are aware and sick of their circumstances, and they're sick of their government rule, a rule by a government that's not necessarily taking their best interests at heart at all. Yeah, you see these small infringements on personal liberty in Cuba. I mean, they now have like new fishing rules where you can't, like, there's a big crackdown on commercial fishing, and so fishermen can't sell fish directly to the average Cubans. They have to sell it to the state at state organized prices. Very similar to things you see in like production areas in communist governments. But yeah, again, I think the protests show they're highly aware of the circumstance they're in, and they want or change.
Yeah, there's been a push public relation wise the last few years. They've allowed more tourism. They've allowed Americans to come in. Of course, internationals have always been allowed to go to Cuba. The accusation is that the Cuban government spent way too much money on the tourism stuff to lure in those outside nationals and not enough on the people and the infrastructure. That's the sort of stuff, that's kind of the Band-Aid on the gaping chest wound stuff that really destabilizes a country. So then you start putting power outages and fuel shortages on top of it. Like we said, we don't think the government's going to fall anytime soon. The potential for civil unrest, though, is really getting multiplied by the day with all these current problems, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think back to my little fish discussion. Apparently the average Cuban, they're only allowed freshwater fish, like catfish, but they see tourists eating swordfish and all the nice fish caught right off the coast of their island country. So I think that kind of stuff kind of puts sand in the wound, so to speak. But at the same time, I think that the Cuban government is seeing tourism as one of the main ways to increase revenue and pay for these things. So it's kind of in that regard, ramping up tourism is definitely a way for the Cuban government to kind of allocate funds where they're lacking. But for the average citizen, it just looks like tourists have more right to live and thrive in Cuba than they do.
Cassandra, Sam joining us. Yeah, you've studied other countries and other governments around the world, especially dictatorships and things like this. This is the core problem with something like Cuba is there's really no way for somewhere like America where we want to have, more freedom for the Cuban people. We want to have more economic opportunity for them. But when you're dealing with a dictatorship, there's absolutely no way to get money into that country that it doesn't go into the government's hands and then get misallocated by that government for their own purposes, and it doesn't get to the intended people. How do you set policy for something like this? Because again, even the Russians who are friendly to that government, they poured money in there. That didn't do any good. China was going to do a big investment thing. They've pulled back on that with some green energy stuff. Britain has pulled back on some investment. What policy-wise do you do when you have a government that's like, we can't put any money in this country because it's just going to go to corruption right off the bat and it's not going to do any good? Is there even a policy fix for something like that?
It kind of depends. I think some of these massive investment projects, encouraging construction and development of these projects and closely monitoring it from a foreign government, that occasionally works, but not too often. And I think that I think China and Britain and Russia are thinking, this might not work here. There's some non-policy solutions that some NGOs have tried. They do small cash donations to the individual Cuban people. Some US entities have tried that in Africa and they've seen that works. But again, I think the main issue is more kind of just working with a government that has no interest in helping its people.
Yeah. And what the other part of this, Cassandra Sean joining us, we're talking a little bit about Cuba down today. Why do we have kind of a cognitive dissonance as America when it comes to Cuba? This is, you're almost swimming distance off the coast. This is only 90 miles off the coast. That's a short plane ride. It's a decently short boat ride. This is a neighbor by any definition of the world on the world stage. And yet we pay very little attention to it. And I know some of that's just stalemate because, the Communist Party and the American government, they haven't gotten along. It's been this way for so long. I think some of it's just probably, apathy and inertia. Why do you think it is, though, that we pay attention to other world events a lot more than we do with something that's this close and this related to our country, both geographically, but also just geopolitically? This has been a thorn in the side of the American government, multiple administrations, both parties for decades. And we don't seem to really want to do anything about it and just kind of deal with the status quo.
I wish I had an answer. You're right. I think there's there's definitely a lot of pushback right now about like how much attention we give Ukraine and we give other issues abroad. But yeah, we do Cuba is so close to us. The Cuban diaspora in Florida is, thriving. So it's very similar. I grew up in San Diego. We're neighbors to Mexico. It's like you hear about issues down south, you see them occasionally day to day interacting with people year round, but we don't do anything as a country. And I think it's a shame.
It's interesting you bring that comparison up because, I've been to San Diego. You go to Imperial Beach, you just walk down the beach and then there's a wall. And it's like, oh, normally a beach doesn't have a wall. It's kind of shocking. If you're not from there, or you go to I forget the name, the shopping mall where half the parking lot's in Mexico.
Las Americas,
there's a freaking wall right there. And you're just not used to seeing walls like that. Is it just out of sight, out of mind, where it's just far enough over the horizon? We don't have walls, but then we have we talk about the southern border. This is an immigration crisis. It's a migrant crisis. It's a human rights crisis. Is it just that it's just enough out of sight, out of mind that you don't have, like we have the images coming across the border and stuff, and it's a smaller amount of people, of course. Is that it? Is it just an optics thing?
I think it's two things. I think like Mexico is not a communist government per se. And so like they're okay with
almost showing some tendencies, so you might want to hold that thought.
No, yeah, the status quo right now has journalists are allowed to travel to Mexico. You hear stories right across the border from at those areas in San Diego, let alone the border where you can communicate with Mexican nationals and American nationals, but you don't really see that. I think the water is enough of a separation where it really kind of it does create a massive barrier. And then you have a government that has no interest in necessarily entertaining bad press. So it's a combination of it. And then at the same time, you have our media where this issue is barely covered in the news, barely covered. You barely hear about it.
Let's talk globally just 1 second. Let's zoom back out like we did when we first started to kind of wrap this up, though, is everybody's having fuel problems. Everybody's having food problems. There's a global financial crisis going on. Talk about worldwide how it shows up. Places like Cuba, places like Sri Lanka, we've been covering a lot on this program. The countries that are already under stress when something like fuel shortages, like the Ukraine war, like food shortages from the Ukraine war. Talk about how these countries that are already on the edge, they go from bad to catastrophic very, very quickly when the geopolitical winds shift just a very little bit. Because people talk about globalism and they use the buzzword. It's an interconnected world, and this is the ugly side of that interconnected world, and it shows up in a hurry in diverse places, doesn't it?
It definitely does. You have prosperous nations with sufficient reserves. Even Europe is freaking out. The UK is concerned about fuel prices, but then you look at Cuba, where they do a little bit of their own domestic supply of oil. They rely mostly on Venezuela, but they're reliant completely on their neighbors' conditions. And when those neighborly conditions kind of turn sour, for Venezuela at least, or they have a less oil coming into the country than they're used to, and their entire infrastructure is reliant on diesel, that's a recipe for disaster. And I think, you're absolutely right. We are going to be seeing a massive increase in protests because at the rate it's going, there's nothing else to do.
Yeah, they're out of options infrastructure wise. Cassandra, Shen, one last question on this. Just globally, when it comes to Cuba, when it comes to some of these other issues in the world, when you have a stalemate like Cuba's been, there's a hard and fast stalemate here as far as American policy towards Cuba and Cuba's policy towards us, frankly. It's a two-way street. What's the better option for us as commentators and just the general public when addressing this? Should we be focusing on the people of Cuba, the human interest stuff, the human rights stuff? Or should we be focusing on the policy stuff, kind of the more which one of those two do you think is more going to be more effective trying to get it until this stalemate seems to loosen up either by an event or something else happens?
As far as injecting into the public consciousness here in the US, I think absolutely the humanitarian stuff. I think us policy wonks, we definitely kind of we appreciate policy analysis, but at the end of the day, it's affecting the average person. But ideally, I'd like to see it like side by side. I think like you see a massive reaction, people being in prison for 25 years for taking to the streets, where that's like something you can do on an average Saturday here in the US. But at the same time, you see these insane policy measures put off by a communist government. And I think that, focusing on the human aspects, but sprinkling in some policy would be very helpful.
Yeah, great stuff, Cassandra. Sean, great to have you back. It won't be so long before we get you back again. But until we do, let folks know what you got going on now that you got all this newfound free time on your hands, now that you're not doing school now. Let them know how to follow you on your social media and what you got going on, my friend.
Yeah, you can follow me at Cassandra Shan on Twitter. Just politics and startups.
Politics and startups, because those two things go together so well nowadays. Cassandra Shan, always a pleasure to talk to you. Good to see you again. We'll talk again soon, my friend. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders. From ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
That'll do it for Heard Tell for today, wherever you are and however you're watching, whether it's on one of the podcasting platforms, if you're watching on YouTube or the Facebook Live page through our partner, Big Talker. We sure appreciate you. Let us know you're out there. Let us know what you think. Good, bad, and different. Agreed, disagreed. Love to hear from you at heardtellshow@gmail.com, at heardtellshow on the Twitter. Love to hear from you. We've done whole segments, even a whole show, just based off things you wanted to talk about. This is a partnership. Love to hear from you. So until we see you again on Heard Tell or on the Good Talk interview segments or on Twice on Sunday or on any of the old podcasts or the best of or whatever it is you're joining us for Heard Tell, we sure appreciate you. We hope you and yours are well. We hope you're well fed. And we will see you again next time for more Heard Tell. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.